Road to Fluency: How I Learned English on a Cross-Country Road Trip. Welcome to Smart English Start. If you've ever wondered how to improve your English in real-life situations, this series is for you. Here, we share the true stories of English learners who found unique ways to become fluent and confident speakers. Today's story is about Olivia Carter, a South African traveler who thought she knew English, until she arrived in the US and struggled with accents, slang, and regional expressions. Determined to improve, she took an unforgettable cross-country road trip from New York to California, meeting people from all over the US and learning how English changes from place to place. Let's dive into her journey. How she went from misunderstanding conversations to speaking English naturally, just by talking to strangers along the road. Episode 1: Realizing I Didn't Understand American English.
Hello, my name is Olivia Carter, and this is my story of how I became fluent in English by driving across the US and learning from the people I met along the way. I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, where English is widely spoken. I had always considered myself fluent. I could write well, I understood movies, and I had no problem reading English books. But when I moved to New York City, I realized something shocking: I didn't actually understand American English. People spoke too fast. They used slang I had never heard before. And worst of all, different regions had completely different accents. That's when I decided I needed to experience English in real life. So, I took a cross-country road trip to learn English from the people who spoke it every day. Arriving in New York, the first reality check. When I landed at JFK Airport, I expected everything to feel familiar. I had traveled before, and English was my first language, so I didn't think I'd struggle. Then, the immigration officer asked, "You here for business or pleasure?" I knew what he meant, but something about the way he said it, so fast, so casual, completely threw me off. I hesitated before answering, I'm moving here." He nodded, stamped my passport, and said, "All right, you're good to go." It was a small moment, but it was my first sign that I wasn't as fluent as I thought. Struggling with fast conversations. A few days later, I went to a cafe in Brooklyn, excited to order my first American coffee. The barista asked, "You want that to go?" I blinked. In South Africa, we say takeaway, not to go. I knew the phrase, but I had never heard it used in such a natural way. I awkwardly said, yes, takeaway." That was when I realized I knew English, but I didn't know how Americans actually spoke it in daily life. The turning point: deciding to learn English on the road. That night, I met up with my American friend, Rachel, who had been living in New York for years. I told her about my struggles understanding people. She laughed and said, "Olivia, that's just New York. Try going down south. People speak a whole different English there." That's when I had an idea. If English sounded different in every region, then the best way to learn it was to hear it in all its forms. I decided to rent a car and take a cross-country road trip from New York to California, stopping in different cities, meeting people, and learning how English changed across America. I didn't know exactly what I would learn, but I knew one thing: the best way to improve my English was to experience it in the real world. And I was about to do just that. Episode 2: Learning to understand different accents in Philadelphia. Hearing a different kind of English. My first stop was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I had always thought of American English as one thing, but I quickly learned that each city has its own unique way of speaking. At a small diner near Rittenhouse Square, I ordered breakfast. The waitress, an older woman, asked, "Use one coffee with that?" I stared for a moment. Use. I had never heard that before. I nodded and said, yes, please. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was this an accent? A slang word? Discovering regional slang. Later that day, I met up with a local friend, Eric, who had lived in Philly his whole life. I asked him, why did the waitress say, use? Is that normal here? He laughed and said, yeah, that's Philly slang. Use is like saying you all, some people still say it, but it's mostly old school. Then he added, you'll hear a lot of weird words here. Like, if someone asks for a John, that just means thing. It can mean anything. I was fascinated. In just one city, there were already so many small differences in the way people spoke. Adjusting to fast speech. That evening, I went to Reading Terminal Market, a famous food hall in Philly. I ordered a cheesesteak, and the guy behind the counter asked, with or without? I panicked. With what? He laughed and said, onions, with or without. It hit me, he was saying with or without onions, but shortening the words. I quickly said, with onions, please, and smiled, feeling like I had passed some kind of test. I realized something important: sometimes, English isn't about understanding every word, it's about recognizing patterns and getting the meaning from context. What I learned in Philadelphia. Before I left Philly, I wrote down some key takeaways in my notebook. Listen for regional slang, every city has its own words. People speak fast, but they shorten words in predictable ways. Don't be afraid to ask someone to repeat themselves. I had only been in the US for a few days, but I was already hearing English differently. Next, I was heading to Nashville, Tennessee, where I would face an even bigger challenge: understanding the Southern accent. Episode 3: Understanding the Southern accent in Nashville. A new challenge: Southern English. My next stop was Nashville, Tennessee, the heart of country music and home to some of the friendliest people I had ever met. But there was a problem. I thought I was starting to understand American English better after Philadelphia, but as soon as I arrived in Nashville, I realized the Southern accent was completely different. Struggling to keep up with conversations. I checked into a small bed and breakfast run by a woman named Linda. As she handed me the keys, she said, "You got any bags in the car? I can grab them for you, hon." I understood the words, but the way she spoke was so different. Her speech was slower, but some words blended together. Got any sounded like goni, and for you became fire. I smiled and said, "Oh, I only have one bag, thank you." But I could tell she noticed that I was struggling to follow. Later, I went to a local barbecue restaurant. I ordered ribs, and the cashier said, "That'll be $12.50, sugar." Sugar? I thought. I wasn't used to strangers calling me things like hon or sugar. But in the South, these words weren't personal, they were just part of how people spoke. I started listening more closely, and I realized some key differences in Southern English. People spoke more slowly, but they connected words together. Some words had a drawn-out, musical tone. Right became rot. Common phrases were different. People said fixin' to instead of about to, as in, I'm fixin' to head out. My first real Southern conversation. The real test came when I visited a live music bar on Broadway. I sat next to a woman named Maggie, and we started talking about travel. At one point, she said, "Bless your heart, you sure are brave driving cross-country all by yourself." I had heard the phrase, "bless your heart," before, but I wasn't sure what it really meant. So I asked, "Wait, is that a good thing?" She laughed and said, "Well, depends on how you say it. Sometimes it means you're sweet, but sometimes it means you made a big mistake. That's when I realized understanding English isn't just about words and grammar, it's about knowing how different cultures use language. By the time I left, I had picked up 3 important lessons. Different regions have different ways of speaking, but you can adapt by listening closely. It's okay to ask for clarification. Americans don't mind explaining their slang. English isn't just about words, it's also about culture. The same phrase can mean different things depending on how it's said. Next, I was heading to New Orleans, Louisiana, where I would face my biggest challenge yet, understanding the Cajun accent and the unique mix of languages spoken there. Episode 4: Navigating the Unique English of New Orleans. My next stop was New Orleans, Louisiana, one of the most unique cities in the US. Not only was it famous for jazz music and Mardi Gras, but it also had its own special way of speaking. Unlike Philadelphia or Nashville, New Orleans English wasn't just an accent, it was a mix of languages. I soon discovered that French, Spanish, and Creole influences had shaped the way people spoke here, making it different from anywhere else I had been. Hearing a new kind of English. My first challenge came at a seafood restaurant in the French Quarter. I ordered a plate of gumbo, and the waiter smiled and said, "Oh, cher, you gon' love this, I guarantee." I blinked. Cher? Guarantee? His accent was different, it sounded like a mix of Southern and French. I later learned that in Louisiana, cher, pronounced shaw, was a friendly term, similar to honey or darling. And I guarantee was a phrase made famous by Chef Justin Wilson, a local celebrity. Later, I took a streetcar ride through the Garden District and sat next to an older man who started chatting with me. He spoke quickly, dropping words like lagniappe, which means a little extra, and face doudou, which means the dance party. I caught some words, but others went right over my head. I smiled and nodded, but I felt lost. That's when I realized I needed to stop pretending I understood everything and start asking questions. Learning to ask for clarification. I decided to be honest when I didn't understand something. At a local cafe, I heard 2 women talking, and one of them said, "Yeah, she passed a good time last night." I was confused. Shouldn't it be "she had a good time last night"? Instead of guessing, I asked the barista, "Hey, I keep hearing people say, passed a good time, what does that mean?" She laughed and said, "Oh, that just means she had fun. It's just how we say it around here." That moment changed the way I approached learning English. Instead of trying to figure everything out on my own, I started asking people about the phrases they used. And every time I asked, people were happy to explain. By the time I left, I had 3 new takeaways. English is not one language, it's a collection of different influences from history and culture. It's okay to ask people what they mean. No one expects you to know everything. Instead of worrying about understanding every word, focus on getting the main idea. Next, I was heading to Texas, where I would test everything I had learned so far and discover the power of confidence in conversations. Episode 5: Finding Confidence in Conversations in Texas. My last major stop was Austin, Texas. By this point in my journey, I had learned to recognize different accents, pick up slang, and adjust to regional speech. But there was still one thing I struggled with: confidence in conversations. Even though I understood English much better now, I sometimes still hesitated. I worried about saying the wrong thing, mispronouncing words, or not keeping up with fast conversations. I needed to push myself one final time, to speak without fear, without overthinking, and without worrying about making mistakes. And Texas was the perfect place to do that. A lesson in confidence from a Texan stranger. My first day in Austin, I walked into a small barbecue restaurant. I stood in line behind a big, friendly-looking guy wearing cowboy boots and a hat. He turned to me and said, "Well now, you ain't from around here, are ya?" I froze. Should I explain my whole road trip? Should I try to match his accent? What if I said something wrong? But instead of overthinking, I just smiled and responded naturally, "Nope, just passing through. First time in Texas." He grinned. "Well, you're in for some damn good barbecue. Better get the brisket, none of that fancy stuff." We kept chatting while we waited in line. He told me about the best places to visit in Austin, and I joined the conversation without hesitation. That was when it hit me, I wasn't thinking about English anymore. I was just talking. Speaking without fear. That moment gave me a confidence boost. Over the next few days, I talked to strangers without rehearsing my sentences beforehand. Tried using new expressions I had picked up along the trip. Stopped worrying about mistakes because no one else cared about them. I realized that fluency isn't just about understanding the language, it's about feeling comfortable using it. The moment I knew I had become fluent. On my last night in Austin, I met a group of locals at a live music bar. We talked for hours about music, travel, and life. At some point, someone said, "Wait, how long have you been in the US?" When I told them I had only been here for a few weeks, they were shocked. "Wow, you sound like you've been here forever." That was the moment I realized I had finally become fluent. Before my road trip, I thought I knew English. But I learned that real fluency comes from using English in everyday life, not just studying it. Every region speaks differently, so you have to listen and adapt. Slang and expressions are just as important as grammar. Confidence is the most important part of fluency. By the time I drove to California, I wasn't just speaking English, I was living it. And the best part? You don't need to take a road trip across America to do this. You can start right where you are, by listening, asking questions, and pushing yourself to use English every day. Fluency isn't about perfection, it's about being comfortable in conversations. This is the final episode of my journey, but your journey is just beginning. Keep practicing, keep speaking, and most importantly, enjoy the process.